Throwback weekend features an old school style butt whooping put on by Martin Truex Jr. NASCAR wheels out the higher horsepower, low downforce rules package for Darlington, and that's all the fans are talking about after the checkered flag. How's it going, y'all? My name is Eric and welcome to Out of the Groove Darlington Throwback Goodyear 400 Race Review Edition. Much to talk about today. We're going to discuss Joe Gibbs Racing's dominance. We'll talk about Kyle Larson's late race push to try and make things more competitive. We'll talk about the throwback theming of the broadcast, and of course, we'll talk about the always polarizing rules package and how that played into the racing today compared to last season when they ran a completely different rules package. We'll get to all that and much, much more. But first, this episode of Out of the Groove is sponsored by HTP America. HTP America is celebrating 40 years in the welding industry. They have their own line of welding equipment, from multi-process machines, incredible TIG welders, and versatile plasma cutters. If you're just a hobbyist or a full-on industrial fabricator, they can customize their machines to fit the criteria you need. HTP America is well known for their Italian-made machines and excellent customer service. HTP is your one-stop shop for all of your welding needs. And they have a special discount code for fans of the show. Use code PP2010 for 10% off your order at usaweld.com. That's usaweld.com, HTP America. Check that link out down in the description and use code PP2010 for 10% off your order. Huge supporters of racing, huge supporters of Out of the Groove. Thank you, HTP America, for sponsoring this episode. Now, I gotta admit, I'm exhausted. We've been having this hotly contested debate for more than 3 years now about what kind of rules package should the NASCAR Cup Series be striving for, which rules packages are best at which types of tracks, what are the redeeming qualities of the high drag, low horsepower package, what are the redeeming qualities of the package we saw at Darlington today, where the cars are a bit more unstable, you saw plenty of slipping and sliding. There's pros and cons to both. We've gone over them countless times in the past 3 years, and I'm exhausted at this point, especially because this is the last year that we will see this exact rules package in action. There are only, I believe, 8 more races featuring the 550 horsepower package. We got tons of road courses coming up where the high horsepower package will be used, and rules packages don't usually come into play, don't really get discussed those weeks. So we're almost to the end of this package. We already know the next gen car is going to handle completely differently, even though the horsepower numbers may stay roughly the same. The cars are going to be a completely different animal. Don't expect the racing next year to look much at all like any of the racing you've seen this year. So this debate has worn me down over the past couple of years, but that's all anyone's talking about after today's race. We'll get to the rules package and we'll talk a little bit about that when we put this race on the Groovy gauge at the end of this episode, but I want to focus on the on-track action, the key players from this race, who ran well, who struggled today. No surprise, Stewart House Racing struggled today, but let's start this episode by talking about the closing laps between Martin Truex Jr., the only driver in the Cup Series this year with more than one win, and Kyle Larson, because Martin Truex won stage 1, he won stage 2 by like 14.5 seconds, just dominated, and he seemed to be running away with things in stage 3 until slightly different pit strategy by the 5 team, shrunk that gap a little bit, and a slightly faster pit stop by the 5 team with about 35 laps to go, got him within about 1.5 seconds of Truex, and Kyle Larson did what we all thought was impossible. He managed to eat into Truex's lead lap after lap after lap. He got within about a car length or so of the 19 car on a couple of different occasions. Aided somewhat by lap traffic. Also, Kyle Larson was clearly running at 110%, while Truex was still maybe managing that gap the way he's known to do. So Larson was testing the limits of that 5 car, that beautiful 3-wide maneuver through the middle of lap traffic with just a few laps to go. Oh my gosh, that might have been the hottest move I've seen all season. Too bad it was in a losing effort, but Martin Truex Jr. held off Kyle Larson to get the win. Truex, like I said, dominated stage 2 especially, and much of stage 3, but Kyle Larson showing great perseverance down the stretch. Those two drivers, I know we can talk about William Byron, who extended his top 10 streak again today, or Denny Hamlin, who has not won yet this year but's been very, very consistent. We can throw in some other names as well. But to me, after today, I think you'd be foolish to not put Martin Truex Jr. and Kyle Larson at the very, very top of your playoff brackets. Truex, of course, because of all the playoff points he's racked up at this point, but Kyle Larson, this was the first time really this year where we saw, borderline race win speed with the 750 package. His only win this year came at Vegas with the 550. He has a few top 5s with the 550 package, but he's been inconsistent at the shorter ovals with the higher horsepower. Today, a very good track for Larson. He shined very, very bright and almost stole the win late in this thing. So honestly, Kyle Kyle Larson impressed me almost as much as Martin Truex Jr. and James Small. You know, is there anybody in the NASCAR Cup Series who's better at just dominating a race when he has the car? Like today, Truex clearly had the best car in the field, credit to James Small, but this seems to be common. Truex is the same guy that led nearly every lap of the Coke 600 a few years ago. When Martin Truex Jr. has a dominant car, he does not relinquish the lead. He doesn't make mistakes, he doesn't commit speeding penalties, his pit crew's usually on it. He doesn't push the car too hard and, hit the wall or something in lap traffic. Martin Truex Jr. is cool as a freaking cucumber under pressure, especially when he has the best car in the field. Mistake-free today, never put a finger out of place. It was quintessential Martin Truex Jr. type action today. He dominated, stunk up the show from time to time, but you gotta credit the guy, especially with the rules package today and the difficulty of Darlington Raceway. Even when he was out there by himself, he was still having to manhandle that car lap after lap. And in the closing stretch against Larson, both those cars were slipping and sliding basically on corner exit lap after lap after lap. Some of y'all say I don't give Martin Truex Jr. enough credit, and you're not entirely wrong there. At the beginning of this season, one of my bold predictions was that Truex would only win, I think, one race this year, same as last season. Well, he's proved me wrong by winning already 3 here in just the first handful of months, by far leading the series now. Nobody else has more than 1 win. Truex now has 3. So credit to Truex and his crew chief James Small. Perfect race car, perfect execution all day long. Martin Truex Jr. gets the win. Kyle Larson finishes 2nd. Let's talk about some of your other top finishers and notable disappointments. Joe Gibbs Racing always strong at Darlington. They mentioned this during the broadcast. So you see Kyle Busch finishing 3rd. He had to come back from early trouble early on in this race while leading. He cut a left rear tire, I believe. Maybe it was a right rear. Whatever tire it was. He actually got into the wall a little bit as a result, but kept the car from sustaining any further damage. Nearly went a lap down, but battled back quickly to contend for a top 5 finish today. You see Denny Hamlin, very quiet afternoon, but again, another very, very solid top 5. William Byron, I alluded to it earlier, extends his top 10 streak, 10 straight races with a top 10. I believe that's the best any driver has done, maybe since Jeff Gordon. Maybe that's just the best any Hendrick driver has done, but I don't know, 10 straight top 10s, that's fairly uncommon. I know a couple years Kyle Busch began the year with like 10 or 11 straight top 10, so maybe it's just the best at Hendrick since Jeff Gordon years and years ago. I'm not sure. Either way, 10 straight top 10s, very, very impressive for young William Byron. Stewart-Haas Racing again had drivers on either end of this deal. Kevin Harvick with a great top 10. You see Chase Briscoe with a decent finish as well. 11th place is pretty good for your first Cup race at Darlington, but the other 2 SHR drivers were both involved in heavy, heavy accidents. 6 laps into this race, Eric Almirola gets sideways. Ricky Stenhouse was all up on his rear bumper and made contact when Almirola had to lift on corner exit. That spun Almirola around. He destroyed the inside safer barrier and completely demolished his beautiful Mark Martin Winn-Dixie flame throwback. So the terrible, terrible, terrible season continues for Eric Almirola. The reason he was that far back in the field anyways was because the team failed inspection multiple times and had to start this race at the rear. So really a team failure today, the team failing inspection, and Eric Almirola getting just a little bit sideways. Yeah, Stenhouse was right there racing him very aggressively, but I don't think you can really put that wreck. You certainly can't put all the blame on Stenhouse there. Tough deal for Almirola. The terrible season continues there in must-win territory at this point if they weren't already. Cole Custer, the other SHR driver, also wrecked similarly to Almirola, although Cole Custer really did nothing wrong. Anthony Alfredo, shortly after a restart, got sideways, came down into Custer. He had nowhere to go. Collided with the inside wall, so 2 SHR cars completely destroyed, but the other 2 get top 11 finishes. Another solid day for Kevin Harvick in that gorgeous 2001 rookie scheme throwback. Simple but effective. Other drivers like Ryan Blaney, Chase Elliott didn't have top speed today, but stayed out of trouble for the most part, and they both come home with top 10 finishes. Oh man, I didn't even notice this. I know both Roush Fenway cars spent most of the day in the top 15, which I even tweeted about because I was very, very impressed. Difficult racetrack. But they end up with 2 top 10s. Look at Chris Buescher and Ryan Newman. Wow, round of applause. That's a huge day for Roush Fenway Racing. I wish that had been made, a bigger deal of on the broadcast. That's a great, great day for that team. I told you guys, Chris Buescher spent most of this season inside the top 16. They've got some speed. I still think Chris Buescher has a really good shot of making the playoffs, even possibly on points. So today was a great day for the 17 car especially. A few notable drivers that did not finish where they perhaps belonged. Joey Logano was up in the top 5 much of the day in that Mario Andretti throwback. He sped on pit road during the final cycle of green flag pit stops, ends up finishing outside the top 10. Christopher Bell as well scraped the wall in the closing laps. He was running, I think, 6th or 7th at the time. Probably should have gotten a top 10, but a late race mistake, very, very costly. He still ends up 14th, but could have been better. Eric Jones, who coming into this weekend had never finished worse than 8th in any of his cup races at Darlington. First time there in non-JGR equipment, ran inside the top 13 or so most of the day until he scraped the wall and cut a tire, ends up finishing 18th. Alex Bowman got into, I believe it was Ryan Blaney late in this race, just got a little tight and I believe later on cut a tire down. And then actually later on after green flag pit stops, they had the tire pressures too low or something and he had to make an unscheduled pit stop, finishes outside the top 15 as well. Rough season for Kurt Busch continues. He's now well outside the top 16 in points after he got loose underneath someone on a restart. And then maybe got a tiny tap from Bubba Wallace, who was right behind them at the time, really nowhere for Bubba Wallace to go. Similar to the Stenhouse Almirola deal, I don't think this one was all on Bubba Wallace. I mean, Kurt Busch was sideways before Bubba even got to him. Not really anywhere the 23 car could go, but Kurt Busch wrecked out of this race as well. And Brad Keselowski, a surprising no-show, ends up finishing 24th, and that's kind of where he ran most of the day. So he was without his normal crew chief Jeremy Bullins today, and I guess that played a factor. They were not on the same page because it seemed like every adjustment they made only made the car worse as the race went on. So a bit surprising, but interim crew chief, that'll happen from time to time. But those are your most notable finishing results right there. Actually, one other driver I have to mention, I was gonna let this go, but Ross Chastain finishes 15th. That's not terrible. It's the second week in a row, actually, that Chastain and that team have shown decent speed, actually. But my goodness, they were running inside the top 10 in stage 1 when, for whatever reason, they decided to not pit with everybody else. They decided to pit out of cycle. In fact, they tried to run the entirety of stage 1 without having to pit under green, so they were giving up 2 to 3 seconds a lap to the rest of the leaders who did pit. If Ross Chastain pits with the leaders, it pits as part of the sequence and cycle with them, he probably finishes anywhere between 8th and 12th at the end of stage 1. Instead, because they took an unnecessary gamble early on, because I guess what, they wanted to save a set of tires for the end? They had plenty of tires, that was not a thing. The gamble ended up falling flat for them. They fell outside the top 20 by the end of stage 1 and went a lap down, and I'm not sure they ever got that lap back. They finished 15th, which means I believe they finished this race a lap down. Terrible, terrible decision by Phil Surgeon, the crew chief, or whoever it is, whatever strategist was making that call. Terrible decision. I mean, I don't hate to call anybody out, but that was just mind-numbingly stupid, I'll be honest. I want Ross Chastain to succeed. That throwback McDonald's scheme looked really, really good. They seemed to have a top 10 car early on, and they just threw it away for no reason at all. So, deserves a ton of scrutiny for that one. That was stupid. I hope they get a talking to this weekend in their meetings. Ganassi fired one crew chief last year from that 42 team when they got rid of Chad Johnston. I gotta wonder if Phil's on thin ice. Ganassi this year has not been fast. Kurt Busch, as I mentioned, has struggled this year, so I don't know what's going on over there, but they need to tighten that ship. Dumb strategy calls like today cannot happen. It was just made no sense. It was stage 1. What are you trying to do in stage 1 by staying out like that and just being a hazard? Putting your car in harm's way and losing all that time. It was dumb. I don't know what they were doing. Anyway, I just could not let that go, so I had to get that one off my chest. I'm gonna talk about the race and the rules package and stuff in just a few moments, but in the meantime, I also want to talk about the theming, specifically the throwback theming of the broadcast today, because I thought FS1 handled today really, really well. Mike Joy, who I slightly criticized, I didn't criticize a few days ago, but I did point out that it felt like he was asleep during the Pro Invitational, the iRacing broadcast Wednesday night. It sounded like maybe he was under the weather. I criticized him a little bit earlier this week. I want to give Mike Joy all of his due here today. He was fantastic. Throwback weekends were built for Mike Joy. Every single paint scheme in the field, Mike Joy seemed to have like a first-hand experience, a first-hand story to tell about the driver or the team that it was referencing. I thought Jeff Gordon and Clint Boyer were fine today as well, but no disrespect to them, they sounded completely clueless about half these throwbacks. Mike Joy was just stomping all over them. They were just getting out of the way like he was a bull in a china shop, and this china shop was full of NASCAR throwback schemes that Mike Joy was just smashing one after the other. He was killing it today. Mike Joy was on fire, so I just wanted to give him some credit because when the broadcast is on point, the millions of fans watching at home typically get a better experience and have more fun viewing it. I had a ton of fun hearing Mike Joy talk about, his relationships with Alan Kulwicki and what those several throwback schemes meant to him. I have friends that are huge NASCAR history nerds, and I'm sure they enjoyed that even more than I did, and I enjoyed it. So credit to Mike Joy and the overall FS1 broadcast team. I thought did a pretty good job today. I love that they updated their graphics with a lot of the throwback number logos. I like that they were able to cut to individual throwback paint schemes and tell those stories, especially during the longer green flag runs when action wasn't as prevalent. The Goodyear blimp was back, the Goodyear 400. I also liked all the fun outfits and stuff. Larry McReynolds with the mustache gosh, I enjoyed it. Throwback Weekend has become a fan favorite since the tradition really began, only about 5 or 6 years ago. But with broadcasts like today, with as much fun as Mike Joy, Larry McReynolds, and the overall Fox team seem to be having with it today, it seems clear that it is here to stay in the long run. I think that's great. I think now that there are 2 Darlingtons on the schedule, you have the Southern 500/playoff opener in the fall, giving this spring Darlington date, the Throwback Weekend credentials and all that stuff really makes it special. So now Darlington, no matter which race you're talking about, is kind of a can't miss special event. So FS1, I thought, handled the throwbackness of today's show really, really well. I didn't even mention at the beginning, you had Leonard Wood and Bill Elliott pacing the field in those vintage race cars. Fox didn't show them as much as maybe I would have liked, but they showed them some. They especially gave the Leonard Wood, in that 21 car, some credit and some good screen time. And a little bit better than what they did for Dale Jr. yesterday pacing the field in that restored race car. So at least for today's race, I want to give FS1 and especially Mike Joy some credit for making it fun to watch. That stage 2 dragged pretty slow, pretty long, but Mike Joy sharing some references and stories kept me engaged for most of it, so I want to give him some credit for that. Now, speaking of long, drawn-out, kind of sluggish stage 2s, let's talk about this race in general, let's talk about the rules packages, and let's put this thing on the Groovy gauge presented by Swan. So today felt, to me at least, just like a typical NASCAR race. There's nothing about this race that really stood out to me that I'm going to look back at and say, oh wow, what a great moment, what a fantastic finish, what a fantastic restart, what a scary crash. There was really none of those moments today. That 3-wide Larson move was probably the closest we got. To me, this was like the perfect, average or maybe slightly above average NASCAR event. There were long runs. Some of them went on a bit long. There was not a lot of competition, especially at the front of the field. But there were also moments, especially I'd say in the first half of this race, you had a few pretty gnarly crashes that fortunately didn't take out 20 cars. Only 1 or 2 cars each time, but still you had that spectacle element, that element of danger that fans are somewhat attracted to. And the finish of this race, we all assumed Martin Truex Jr. was going to just run away after that final cycle of pit stops, but he didn't. Kyle Larson subverted our expectations and contended for the final 30 laps there. He never quite got to Truex's bumper, but he certainly put pressure on him. He made those last 30 laps way more interesting than any of us expected them to be. So that's what I mean when I say this was a very average, very typical NASCAR race. Not every NASCAR race every Sunday is going to be a total barn burner that we remember for years. It's not going to be Chicagoland 2018 every week or, Talladega the last few years. You do need some of these just baseline average NASCAR races to make the special, the great races, more distinct. Now, transitioning the conversation to the rules package, this was the first Darlington race since, I guess, 2018 to feature the smaller spoiler, lower downforce, bit higher horsepower with 750 under the hood. You could tell, and I appreciate Fox showing that sort of throttle comparison from last year to this year, you could tell that teams and drivers had to play with the throttle a whole lot more. In many cases, drivers were not fully mashed out on the gas until they were pointed straight off the corner onto the front or back straightaway. Like exit of the corner, very exit of the corner, they're still playing with the throttle because Darlington is that slick, it's that difficult. And with no big spoiler on the back, the cars are all the more unstable. Now, that alone allowed for some great shots, some great moments, even down the stretch when Truex was trying to hold off Kyle Larson. And we all believed he had the clearly better car. That 19 car was still hung out more often than not. You could clearly see it on TV, and he was able to, in many cases, keep his foot on the gas and drive through that skid. And to me, that was the mark of a great driver. That just showed how great Martin Truex Jr. is. He's obviously one of the top drivers in the sport, and he got to put that skill on full display at the end of this race. So I must say, I really enjoyed seeing that slipping and sliding, driver element once again, apparent at Darlington Raceway. We haven't seen that kind of sliding consistently at Darlington since 2018. I greatly missed it, and I loved seeing it here today. But at the same time, I think objectively speaking, if we go back to some of the Darlington races, remember we raced at Darlington 3 times last year, had that doubleheader, and then later in the season the Southern 500. Raced at Darlington a lot last year, all with the 550 high downforce, high drag package. I think objectively, many fans are going to look at today's race and say that, it was probably not quite as entertaining as at least 1 or 2 of last year's races with the high downforce package. And, I might even be in that same boat because I can't blame them. Last year had some great Darlington moments like, at the end of the year, Martin Truex Jr. trying that slide job on Chase Elliott late in the race for the win, wrecks them both or puts them both in the wall. Huge drama. That's great TV. That's what gets fans out of their seat. Or early in the season, there's that controversy. Remember Chase Elliott flipped off Kyle Busch after he misjudged, him sliding in behind Elliott and dumped Elliott into the inside wall in the final closing stretch. Those memorable moments late in those races last year, and those races overall were not terrible, even with the, dirty air and the high downforce, those races last year were not terrible. I think many fans are going to look back at least 2 of last year's races. The first year race last year was but at least 2 of those Darlington races last year I think were more entertaining than the race today. But, and I've said this before, and I tweeted this today, in my opinion, a boring 750 horsepower race is more fun to watch than a boring 550 horsepower race. Now, while today the field was very strung out for much of the afternoon, when you got 750 horsepower under the hood, less downforce, watching a car drive that rules package by itself and seeing them hang it out from time to time is more entertaining than watching, the 550 package run single file where nobody's getting loose really. So if I was going to compare those two, I'd go 750 all the time. But here's the thing, as I mentioned at the very beginning, an entertaining 550 race I think is more fun to watch than a boring 750 horsepower race. And I don't think today's race was boring, at least for the most part. I do not think today's race was boring. I don't think it was as entertaining as at least 2 of the 550 races last year. So, that's what's making this debate so hot, so tense. We know NASCAR isn't going back to 900 horsepower anytime soon, maybe ever again. Manufacturers don't want it, it's not happening. But with the lower horsepower going forward, are these slipping and sliding style of races the future? Or is the future more like the 550 high drag, high downforce package when it comes to tracks like Darlington? NASCAR's already basically given us their answer when it comes to short tracks and road courses, as opposed to when it comes to, Texas. But the jury is still out on what racing at Darlington is going to look like next year and, many years from now. I love the 750 package. I love seeing drivers slip and slide. I love seeing drivers have to work harder than they had to last year. But it's a difficult call because I think if you poll the average fan, the average NASCAR fan, I think they would say that at least 1 or 2 of last year's Darlington races were more fun to watch than what we saw here today. And it's not necessarily the package, it's just maybe circumstances. Today's race could have been super exciting. Say Larson was a little faster than Truex at the end there, and they'd gotten side by side, battling it out. That would have been thrilling. I think fans would have loved that. But, a lot of today's race, I think, was overshadowed by the fact that Martin Truex Jr. just had a fantastic race car. We've seen guys dominate with the 550 package at tracks. It's not unusual. Dominance is going to lead to disgruntled fans no matter what rules package or what track it happens at. Hell, even Talladega, a track that was almost universally acclaimed by the average NASCAR fan, back in 2018 when those SHR cars dominated, fans hated it. It was boring. It was one of the worst Talladega races in recent memory, according to most every fan you ask. But that's why I don't really like talking about the rules package. I prefer less downforce at most of these racetracks, but I also want entertaining racing. I think there's a way you can achieve both. I think the first half of today's race had both, but sometimes circumstances are gonna skew opinions one way or the other. That's all I'm gonna say. Let's put this thing on the Groovy gauge. I'm gonna give today's race a 55% on the Groovy gauge. It kind of goes along with what I've been saying this whole time. It was a very average race. Stage 2 was not fun to watch because Truex had a huge lead and there wasn't a lot of movement further back in the field, but again, that happens with every rules package at every type of track at some point or another, especially when you have a guy like Truex who's just dominating. That's not going to happen every week regardless of what rules package we're using. I thought the end of this race, the final 30 laps, were very intense, were very fun. I thought the first stage and a half were really fun. You did have a couple big wrecks in there that sort of shook up the running order and created some drama. So not a bad race by any means, but not quite as exciting as I think many of us were hoping for. Throwback weekend was a super nice sort of filter or lens to watch this entire race through, so I love it. I'm excited for next year's Throwback weekend already, but that's my score, 55%. What would you guys give this race? I have it right there. That's an average score. That's pretty average. In fact, that's probably even lower than average by my standards typically, but I'll stand by it. What would you guys give this race down in the comments below? That's gonna do it for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you again to our sponsor, HTP America. And thank you as always to our amazing Patreon supporters. Could not do this show without your tremendous support. I greatly appreciate it. Be sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel. We talk NASCAR daily here at Out of the Groove. And I know we're gonna have a lot to talk about later this week, so you're not gonna wanna miss any future episodes, any future uploads on this channel. I appreciate the support. I hope you all had a fantastic weekend. I will see you back here again tomorrow. Have a fantastic rest of your day.